Now, this should be the last video of the year, unless I end up procrastinating, in which case it will probably be one of the first videos of 2023. But you can simply pretend that you're hearing this mid-December, and then a lot of the audio that is going to come next will make a lot more sense that way. So, this list will follow the same general rules as the top 10. I must have played the game myself, and it must have been released anywhere from December of last year to November of this year. With that being said, this list will be shorter than the previous, or at least I'm going to try to make it shorter, as I really only want to talk about a few games. I don't make a habit of playing games that look like they won't be a good time for me. I will, however, acknowledge some of these. I'm aware that they exist, and the general discussion around them indicates that people were either disappointed by them or worse. I guess you can consider those the honorable mentions. Saints Row. I took one look at the poster and said, no thanks. That looks nothing like Saints Row outside of the general purple color scheme. The Calypso Protocol. I was never into Dead Space, so I was never going to try that one out, even if it had been well received. Babylon's Fall. I was actually surprised to find this while browsing the PS Store. It was relatively close to its release, as I'd actually had nothing about the game. I really liked the art. I generally like JRPG stuff, but once I saw that it was a live service, I knew there was no rush, as nowadays I tend to give live service games about a year before I try to check it out, because I know that most of them, within that time, you will know whether or not it's actually worth your time. I kind of let the early adopters go and check it out first, and if it doesn't go well like this one didn't, then I don't bother myself. Sonic Frontiers. That's another one that I would not have played no matter how well received it was. It's just not my thing. Vampire the Masquerade Swan Song. That's one of my favorite in-game universe, the Vampire the Masquerade universe. But this game is just so janky to look at and play. You know, come to think of it, maybe this one should have actually been on the list, because I did play it. I do have substantial thoughts. I guess I just didn't expect much from it, so to me it wasn't that disappointing. And the final mention is Diablo Immortal. Honestly, that turned out exactly as I assumed it would, so I don't think it would qualify for the list even if I had played it. On to the main entries of the list. To be clear, I don't consider any of the games to be unplayable. These are just the ones where given the resources, experience, and competence previously of the developers, I feel like the final products should have offered a lot more than what we got. So the first one is the one I care about the least, that's Overwatch 2. Now the actual game itself, you know, everything that happens once you actually step onto the actual, you know, arena until the play of the game, that's all fine. It's still Overwatch. Nothing much has changed there, except it went from being 6v6 to 5v5. Characters have a few more characters now have passives depending on the roles, and some of the kits were tweaked around. But I've seen games achieve all of this, smaller games on much smaller budgets that are nowhere near the size of Blizzard, achieve all these changes within a patch, within like one major patch. So my issue with the game is specifically the two. The game being marketed as a sequel promises, you know, a different experience, but there is nothing here. It's still just Overwatch at the end of the day, just with a different marketing model. So everything that was advertised here is just a ploy to get people to come in and check out their free-to-play marketing offer. So Overwatch 2 was never really a new game, at least not yet, and I guess that's my personal beef. I was sick of Overwatch 4 years ago when Brigitte was released. Around that time I was already burnt out, so I stopped playing, and upon reinstalling the game 4 years later, it almost feels like only 1 year's worth of changes happened within that entire time. So I tried it out for a few hours, and like most people, I assume, realized there's nothing much here unless you're new to the game or have never had a chance to play Overwatch, or you're one of the people who really stuck out with it. Also, there was a discussion around the skins and their pricing and the events. I have no interest in skins generally for first-person shooters. I usually only have interest with skins when it's third-person games, because I can see my character. So I have no interest in their skins, and I was never going to buy one, and the only ones I have was from the original game when they used to give us, you know, free loot boxes and event loot boxes every now and then. So no interest there. Anyway, Overwatch 2 receives the Destiny 2 award for unnecessary sequel. This sequel genuinely could have just been an update. Moving on, next up is Gotham Knights. Now, despite making a decent effort with the story and some of the interactions between the main cast of characters, Gotham Knights feels extremely compromised. The open world, side activities, combat, crafting, resource mechanics, they all feel very uninspired and like they were designed by simply using a quick how-to guide for open world games. It also feels like it was planned to be live service, and then like they changed it to be single player or two-player co-op later in development, with one of the worst attempts to hide the evidence of their previous attempt. The most obvious aspect is the weird crafting resource pool that makes no sense given how it's tuned. You receive way too much of these weird crafting resources to ever need to even monitor how much you have, and worse still, the game provides you with level appropriate gear anyway just by you playing the story, so it's that much more puzzling why the crafting system even exists at all. It only makes sense if most of these skins were intended to be like put in a grind fest kind of live service game, or if they were meant to be sold on the market. Then there's the weird elemental effects that the characters can add to their weapons and utilize, different resistances to various elemental damage that just, it's as random as it is in the Avengers game, the Marvel's Avengers game. There are times when it's clear in cutscenes that rather than using dialogue specific to each of the 4 main characters, the devs used placeholder dialogue that can work regardless of how many characters the game eventually added to its main cast. Now the problem with this kind of thing is that, especially if you've done like the knighthood, this game has like a string of missions called the knighthood missions, where you can unlock like the character's main traversal system, which in my opinion should be open right from the start. But once you unlock the knighthood for each of them, there is this cutscene with Alfred that happens, and it's just the same for each of them. It's kind of cool the first time you see it, but once you're doing it for like the 3rd character, the dialogue begins to lose its impact. It's one of those open world problems, right, where sometimes the dialogue just isn't as impactful because you're fully aware that this dialogue has no context. They can't compensate for which character you will have the dialogue with, so the NPC characters just say their lines. Your characters will fit in their dialogue, but it never feels like they're talking to you, which sucks because there are certain missions like the Harley Quinn one where it is the context is changed for every individual character, and that one feels much cooler because it feels like the character you select to play the mission actually matters, and it highlights even more in the sections where that isn't done. And lastly, worst of all, is the enemy difficulty scaling. And this is what really caught my attention with this title. Never in any game I've played before have I ever felt the need to adjust difficulty levels on the fly. It's always an option, but let's be real, most of us don't use it. You pick a difficulty that works for you and then just play the game with that. Maybe if you realize it's too hard or too easy, you adjust it once and then you play on the new difficulty. But the enemy tuning in this game is so busted that when I played on normal difficulty, regular enemies, you fight them just fine, but then these huge mini boss type enemies have an unbelievable amount of health and damage mitigation. So in order to make them workable, especially if you value your time, it almost incentivizes you to keep changing the difficulty. And to be clear, adjusting the difficulty does not change enemy tactics or anything. It simply changes how long you're going to spend fighting the guy, and some of these enemies have almost unblockable attacks, so it can get really annoying. So in order to make the game more manageable and not waste a lot of time, I would have to constantly switch from normal difficulty when facing regular enemies in order to have fights last long enough for me to be entertained. And then when like the big boss enemy was left, or like one of the little mini bosses, I would then switch the difficulty to an easier one in order to take them out in 1 or 2 hits, due to just how absolutely frustrating some of these enemies were. This has never happened to me before in any game, I mean, I can tell if a game is too difficult for me and I'll put it on an easier mode. I'm not too proud for that. But to keep flipping it up and down, that's not happened before. So if anything, this game will at least be memorable for that. So Gotham Knights receives the Marvel's Avengers Award for the most compromised vision. Last and definitely not least is Pokemon Scarlet. Now, growing up, I played mostly Japanese-based titles and Pokemon was one of my favorites. I eventually stopped keeping up with the titles around the time Black and White came out and only picked up the series again recently with Sword and Shield. Now, it definitely had not come as far as I would hope after all these years, but my nostalgia gag was guaranteed I would at least have a good time with the experience. So I had a certain level of excitement when the new game came out this year. I didn't hear about Legends Arceus, but I definitely heard about Scarlet and Violet. Now, these games, especially Scarlet's the one that I played, it makes commendable attempts to improve some aspects of the experience, focusing on going open world and providing a certain level of freedom within how you can take on gym leaders, as well as having two other independent storylines, one with the very lame Team Star and then hunting of Titan-sized Pokemon. Now these can be taken in any order that you wish and switched around depending on whether the player wants to prioritize one thing over another. Of all these games, this is the one I find most disappointing because I had and I actually am still having a great time with it. I assume it's the nostalgia for me, having done this for a good amount of my life. Hearing some of these older songs just makes me smile like an idiot every time, no matter what, and I think that's why they never really change them. There's also been some genuine quality of life improvements, like being able to grind for XP without always having to initiate those fights, single button healing for targeted party members. Pokemon, in my experience, is one of those things which you're either into or you're not, and if you are a basic repeat of the same thing as last time with minor changes, is normally enough to keep you going. I assume it's the same thing for people who enjoy the likes of Call of Duty and FIFA. The truth is, my opinions towards the game are very biased due to having a lifelong love for the series and especially the original generations of the monsters. So I feel a lot of strain when I have to judge it through the objective lens that I try to use when critiquing things. With that being said, I cannot express how much of an absolute shit show this title is. Nearly everything the developers attempted, they managed to somehow fumble. There's the technical stuff like single-digit frame rates for any character that's not currently in focus, NPC models vanishing depending on where you're standing, sudden heavy drops in frames when you get to specific towns and environments, and this is for a game that doesn't look anywhere nearly as demanding as games that are able to perform better and have much more impressive technical accomplishments. Then there's the general rehash of the Sword and Shield formula, especially when you're following the track of the gym badges, simply substituting Dynamaxing with, is it terraforming or whatever they call it, where the characters go, they glow and then they have like a change to their type or an upgrade to the type that they have. Even the chanting song from those boss battles makes a return. So it's clear that a lot of the core framework is basically lifted right from last year's title, which makes it even worse that they somehow managed to make it less technically impressive while ripping off a lot of the same structure. The worst offender is the general feeling of cheapness that permeates the whole experience. It looks, feels and plays like something that should have been done by a much smaller team. Now, while to some extent that has always been part of, I guess, the appeal of these titles, here it just feels off. In an open world setting with the ability to move the camera around and a lot more player agency, it just comes off a lot worse than usual. A lot of the environments are really ugly here. The camera angles in battles often fail to focus on the action without you having to manually move them. Most of the animations feel lazy, though again that isn't new with the series. There's the other layer that's just wasted potential, the continued lack of NPC voices, the need to always have an evil team even though they generally don't know what to do with them. And speaking of, that particular plotline was really the worst of all three of them. And In my opinion, the starter 3 are ugly as well. I don't like any of their forms. There's a limited selection of body types to choose from, even though you see various student types as you move around the world. I suspect this was because they needed to work with the bike and they couldn't just have various body types, tall, short and large, all work seamlessly with the vehicle mechanic. But you know, if they took more time, I think they could have figured it out. I would have liked to create a goofy looking student character to walk around with, but that's just that's a personal wish list for me. So yeah, it's all in all, it's a mess. It's a fun mess, but definitely one of the jankier releases out there, and one of the bigger disappointments of the year for sure. So Pokemon Scarlet receives the Cyberpunk 2077 award for the game that was definitely not ready for release. So yeah, that's the list. I guess I'll see you in the new year, unless it's already the new year when I release this, and thanks for watching.